So far, we established that violence has been embedded throughout our history since the beginning of time, and that all violence is interconnected in a way, right? They're framed within the larger social, cultural, and individual right world in which we live, and there's a number of ways in which this violence breeds more violence. Okay, but the question right remains: why do we do it? Why are we violent? Right? Some people like to believe in the good of people, and so they want to believe violence wouldn't ever happen, but we know it does. So why? Okay, and traditionally there's been two explanations for this. So on one hand, you have the nature approach, and this is the idea that our biological makeup, our genetics, that is what determines our behavior. It determines our personality, our abilities. Okay, and because violence is a behavior, it then follows that our biology determines whether or not we become violent. And on the other hand, we have the nurture approach. And from this approach, right, it is our social environment and our upbringing that determines whether or not we become violent and determines whether or not, any of our behaviors. Okay, so again, on one hand, you have our biology leads to our behaviors or determines our behaviors, and on the other is your social environment, your parenting, your, who you were raised around, how you interacted with them, what they taught you, what you learned. Okay, and so traditionally, these were very opposing viewpoints, but now we tend to understand that it's probably best explained as nature and nurture, okay? And we'll dig into that a little bit more. But before we go any further, it's important to keep in mind that all behavior is layered, right? So there are influences on everyday decisions we make at so many different levels. So your decision to engage in a violent act, right? So I don't know, if you get in a bar fight, right, is going to be influenced by who you are as a person, right? So whether you are, what your temperament is like, maybe your size, your gender certainly matters. Okay, a side note, we know that men are significantly more likely to engage in violence than women. And so all those individual level matters, but that there's also, layers beyond that, right? So you also have whether or not people at the bar are getting involved and worked up around this violence, and whether or not violence is acceptable in that culture, right? Think about if you live in a place where guns are illegal and people don't really engage in violence. It would be very shocking and surprising if somebody pulled out a firearm. Okay, and so again, our individual decisions are influenced by factors at the individual level, but as well as the societal one. Okay, so the very early explanations of violence were rooted in what we knew at the time, and at the time we were very religious. That was how we understood things and framed things. Okay, and so the demonic perspective was this idea that the devil made me do it, right? That certainly only somebody that's been affected and influenced by the devil could engage in violence. Okay, and it had to be some supernatural force that caused this behavior because no human would do it otherwise. We will then enter the Age of Enlightenment, and during this time there was this significant shift to adopting a more scientific approach to understanding the social world. And so they became less concerned with superstition and religious beliefs and more of how are we actually going to measure and identify it. And so what this did was led to the development of what's traditionally seen as like the first school of criminological thought. Okay, and this is known as classical criminology. And the most dominant theory that came out of this is the rational choice theory. Okay, and so accordingly, violence and all behavior is a choice. We actively choose to engage in violence. And so this theory assumes a couple things here. It assumes first that we're rational actors, meaning that we are capable of having forethought, right? We can see what will happen if we do a certain thing. We can predict the outcomes of our actions. Okay, and so with that, we then look at our outcomes and we weigh those. And then we select the option that's going to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain, or maximize our benefits and minimize our costs. Okay, and so this kind of weighing of our options is known as the cost-benefit analysis. And so, for example, say that bar fight I mentioned, say you were in this bar fight, you're going to be like, okay, well, if I hit this person in the face, it's going to make me feel a lot better. They're going to stop talking. They're going to be knocked out. I'm going to show how awesome I am and how, big and bad I am. Okay, but at the same time, I also might get arrested. I'm going to get kicked out of this bar. I'll never be allowed back here again. I could get hit and get injured. Okay, and so for me, at least, weighing those, for me, that's way more costs. I'm not engaging in that violence. But for somebody else, they may not care about getting arrested. So they're going to choose that violence because the benefit of shutting that person up outweighs the risk of going to jail and getting arrested. Okay, so then we see after this kind of demonic perspective shifts into the classical theory, now we shift into the biological approaches. And what these are, again, this is that nature kind of mindset, right? That nature is what causes or underlies our behavior. So the evolutionary theory is this idea that just as all of our other behaviors evolved to help us survive, violence has remained because it's a means for survival, right? It can eliminate competition. It can eliminate threats against your safety. And so violence is a tool then, right? It's an evolutionary tool. It's been to our benefit to retain violence because it allows us to protect ourselves. And we can see some examples of this, right? So if you look at males in particular, as I mentioned, right, males are more violent, but they tend to be more aggressive as well, just in general. And so this kind of intermale, what I mean by that is male and male, right? Why is there this heightened level of violence between them? Well, one argument goes, well, they're competing for status and for resources. And so how they will achieve those is by being the toughest and the strongest and the baddest. Think about the animal kingdom, right? The men will compete to get to mate with the woman of the herd, right? And it's the same idea that they will compete and fight with each other to show who's the biggest and baddest. And obviously we don't do the same thing literally as humans, but we do have certain ways in which men will turn to those kind of machismo behaviors, right, to demonstrate their physical strength as a means to obtain status. Okay, we also can see this in animals as well, right? So I have 2 dogs, and they're the best, by the way, and they're sweet as pie. But if a stranger or somebody they don't know, or somebody that they do know but they aren't expecting, right, walks up to our house, they aren't so sweet anymore. And it's because their instinct is to protect their territory, because that's where we stay safe. That's how we survive. Okay, and humans do the same as well. Okay, and really all this comes back to this idea of status and dominance. So violence is a means to achieve status. Okay, we'll come back to that in the sociological theories in the next video, but it's relevant here as well because status and dominance is what allows you to survive. So the next biological kind of approach that came from here, right, is this idea of phrenology. Okay, and so phrenology has been largely debunked, but it's still so relevant to us and for us because it began this discussion of how the brain and what other physical characteristics might be involved in criminality and in violence. Okay, so Francis Joseph Gall, he is the one who developed this phrenology. And what he did is as you see in this picture on the left, he mapped out on a human skull what parts of the brain are responsible for different things. And so then he said, okay, well, we can look at a person's head, and if it's real big on this side or if it's bulging over here, then we know that they're going to have defects or certain alterations in their behavior that other people's don't have. Okay, and so from this perspective, and this is true for evolutionary theory as well, but especially from this phrenology and the Lombroso one that we're talking about next, is that violence is inherent, right? Violent criminals are born that way. They're not choosing to act that way. So remember that rational choice theory is saying people aren't inherently criminal. They're not born violent. They choose to be violent. Okay, from the phrenology perspective, that's not the case. If you look like that, you were born that way, that's it. Okay, now, as I mentioned, that one on the left is the traditional model, but this was just a funny meme that I think is a modern day way to think about phrenology, but I do think that probably many of you can relate to that, of how your brain is set up, right? And again, it's important to note that this has been largely debunked. It really has. But it was so significant for us because it was the first notable effort to get away from the superstition of the demonic perspective and to really create a scientific, observable, objective way to assess somebody's likelihood of violence. Okay, and so this was also continued by the work of Cesare Lombroso, who's that gentleman in the bottom down there. And Lombroso is often considered the father of criminology because he was one of the first to develop this scientific explanation for behavior, for violent behavior. And so for Lombroso, violent criminals are what are known as atavisms. Okay, so an atavism is a evolutionary throwback, right? They haven't evolved like the rest of us to develop the refined behaviors and the restraint from engaging in violence. So for him, the people that are engaging in violence are simply those that haven't developed and progressed to where all of us are. Okay, and so for him, what was so important about it was he identified a list of observable, measurable characteristics that could be used to assess a person's likelihood of violence. So these included things like your eyes being too close together, your ears protruding out, your eyebrows being real bushy and coming together in the middle over the bridge of your nose, a small head, right? And various things that we now know they're just as likely to be prevalent in people that are not violent criminals as they are in those that are. But this was so critical because, again, it's this, he is trying to eliminate the bias and trying to make a more objective explanation. We also know that the brain certainly has an important influence on behavior. Okay, and so there's a couple of factors worth noting here. So the first is the neurotransmitter serotonin. So serotonin is our feel-good chemical. This is the one that makes, if we have high levels of serotonin, we'll feel very happy. We'll have a lot of impulse control. But if we have low levels of serotonin, we are more likely to experience depression, anxiety. We'll have trouble sleeping. We'll experience impulsivity. And so with that in mind, right, people with low levels of serotonin are more likely to engage in violence. Okay, because they have less impulse control. So they're more likely to, if somebody comes at them, react impulsively, which might be in the form of violence. Okay, and then testosterone is, and I will say this fully, full transparency here. If you leave today and you go, oh, the only biological thing that matters is testosterone, I have failed you. Because testosterone is the research supporting the influence of testosterone on violence behavior is so mixed and conflicting and contradictory that nobody can say with a great amount of, confidence that high levels of testosterone are linked to violence. So testosterone is a hormone. It is both men and women have testosterone, but there's greater amount than in men. And so oftentimes testosterone has been pointed to explain the difference between the male and female rates of violence. However, anybody that finds empirical evidence that testosterone is linked to violence, nobody's been able to replicate that. So take it with a grain of salt here, right? It certainly appears that testosterone seems to be more relevant for this, dominance seeking as opposed to actually violence. Okay, and then the other reason why we know that the brain matters for behavior is that people that experience significant brain injury will sometimes have considerable changes in behavior. So, for example, I'm sure some of you football fans are familiar with CTE, which is, chronic traumatic encephalitis or something like that. And it's a result of taking too many blows to the head over and over again. People will have, these microabrasions in their head that gradually build up and cause brain damage. And these people that experience CTE are so much more likely to engage in violence. And even those that were never violent in the first place. And so it certainly suggests to us that there's something going on in the brain that is worth understanding to be able to explain why violent behavior occurs. Okay, and it's just important to note, as I mentioned, that we really don't think about things like nature versus nurture anymore. It's really now we kind of understand that biological factors set the predisposition, right? They determine, they kind of set your propensity or your ability to become violent. So some of us might have very high propensity for violence and some of us might have very low propensity. But then from there, how the social environment interacts with us and shapes us will determine whether or not that comes in, that violence comes into fruition. Okay, and so what this is showing you here is that the biological factors are so critical because they influence how the individual interacts with the social world, right? But also how the social world interacts with the individual. Okay. All right, I'm going to leave there. We'll pick up on the next video with the psychological theories. Stay tuned.